I'm going to announce our first speaker today. Philip Crim is an assistant professor of biology at the College of St. Rose in Albany, New York. He is a self-described woody plant enthusiast and believes locations have unrealized potential for providing ecosystem services that can enhance the quality of life in local communities. He is interested in leveraging underutilized trees and shrubs with an emphasis on native and edible species to provide a cornerstone based on species diversity within communities. This approach is interested in ex situ conservation, as he believes that the best way to protect plants and our own human interest in a changing world is to share and distribute the unique genetics found in extreme and edge-of-range populations as components of region-specific sustainable infrastructure. To this, life freedom on a farm in Elbridge, New York, sustainable and botanical knowledge.
Hi, Phil Crim. I'm naturally kind of a loud talker, and this is a little bit of a different setup than I'm used to. All right, now we can see more of the thing. Thank you. I'm used to having one screen and basically have a laser pointer, walk around, and that's kind of how I talk usually in my classrooms. My rooms have been just loaded with plants. We have some pretty good exposure, so I tend to walk around holding plants, pointing out plants. So being stuck to the podium is a little bit of an adjustment. So if I start to wander or if I talk too loud, just be like, Phil, keep it under control. I'm going to be talking to you guys today about the Albany Pine Bush, which is this really, really cool, unique inland pine barrens ecosystem in upstate New York. And as we're going to see, it's this really unusual and unexpected to me when I moved there, because I'd heard about this place, but I hadn't really explored it yet to any extent. This really interesting melting pot of Quercus species. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And hopefully we'll see something that that might interest some of you. There's some really cool hybrids. So let's just have a brief introduction of myself. My graduate work, I did my PhD at West Virginia University, and it focused on nutrient cycling and also tree biodiversity effects in Appalachian forests. And it specifically had a focus on high elevation stands. My lab's big grant was actually focused on a large screening project that used poplars and willows, and what we were looking for were two specific traits. We wanted to use Populus and Salix as plants to revegetate old mine sites in West Virginia, because West Virginia has a lot of environmental issues. First and foremost, mountaintop removal, acid mine drainage, and we wanted to be able to have some plants that we could use to, at the very least, kickstart an ecosystem, kickstart succession on some of these really, really disturbed habitats. And maybe actually have a few plants that we could get into a biomass rotation and actually get some productive use out of these old sites that were really, really not productive. You know, they're basically just wastelands at the moment. So we were looking for low phosphorus tolerance and high aluminum resistance in those soils. And we were able to find, I believe, 7 clones of Populus that had both of those, but I left before our screening of the willows finished up. So that's the kind of work that I'm really interested in, is using plants to solve some of these problems that are really, really challenging that we're facing right now, and that we're only going to continue to face, right? Like our problems are definitely not dwindling in number, they're only increasing. So I've been an assistant professor of biology at the College of St. Rose since August of 2018. We're a small liberal arts college. So our research is pretty much limited to student-driven undergraduate projects. We don't have any plant-specific majors there. I teach an upper division plant ecology course and an environmental science course for non-majors, and of course the general biology courses. And I try to use those to indoctrinate our students into how awesome plants are, maybe slip in a few Quercus references as well, because we have the pine bush right next door with all of those species. And basically try to find interested students that can do some cool studies, you know, just on a small budget, really hands-on. Some work we've done was a germination study for Torreya taxifolia, which is this endangered species down in Florida. It's unfortunately one of those species that's been really afflicted by a pathogen, actually possibly multiple pathogens. So we wanted to see if we could figure out more efficient way to germinate the seeds, because they have some dormancy issues. It's not as simple as just going out and sowing them. There's multiple treatments that are really needed to produce some good seedlings. So we were working on that. One thing I'm working on setting up this fall is to assist with monitoring Adirondack Betula minor populations, which is a stabilized hybrid that might be acting like a good species, and it's only on, I believe, 3 Adirondack high peaks. We're going to see if we can get permission to collect seed and see how uniform the progeny are, and from there maybe look into some of the cytotypes of the progeny. And of course, one of my favorite genera aside from Quercus, Crataegus. I like going into old historical records and seeing if we could find some of these species that are very mysterious. There's a list in Flora of North America of these species that they don't really know how to treat because they couldn't find the type specimens. The old location information is pretty sketchy. And of course, as a lot of you probably know, there was this period of time in which a lot of Crataegus were described based on very, very minute details. So some of them that Flora of North America didn't treat are actually found in the Albany area. So I'm trying to track down those locations. Of course, Crataegus is a very, I don't even want to say ephemeral. I think transitory is the best word. They tend to come in after disturbance, and some of the unique forms just don't linger very long. So maybe I'll be able to find some of these. It looks like I found 2 good historical locations of mystery species, but time will tell. And of course, as Ryan mentioned, I'm working on establishing Lime Ledge Botanical Garden and Arboretum, which I could give a whole presentation on, but just as just kind of in a nutshell, it's this place that I would like to use to bring together the public and kind of give them the opportunity to see some native species that they might not otherwise be introduced to. And of course, Quercus, a lot of people view it as kind of a monolith. I have a good friend that's a retired city forester with the city of Albany, and he told me a few weeks ago that he's not even confident, you know, that Quercus volupna is a good species because he can't tell it apart from the other red oaks in the area. But you see one Quercus volupna, and it looks very distinct. Like you can never unsee it, right? And we'll see some in my slides today. But this is an issue that we have with complex genera. They're not always the most accessible, even for some professionals to really get a good handle on. And that's something that I would really like to address. So a little bit of background on the Albany Pine Bush. The Albany Pine Bush Preserve Commission was approved by the New York State Legislature in 1988. And the pine bush itself is believed to once cover approximately 150 square kilometers. It currently includes only 3,200 acres, though, located between the cities of Albany and Schenectady. And it's one of only about 20 inland pine barren ecosystems globally. So it's really unique. And to go around in that area and see the landscape, it looks more like something you would see along the Jersey Shore. It's really, really unique. It has a character that's much different from the mesic forests that surround it. And just to kind of give you an impression of like a typical a typical view from the Pine Bush. The Pine Bush Preserve is open to the public. There's a very large network of trail systems. And if you're hiking on one of those trails, this is pretty much what it looks like. You see a lot of scrub oaks. We had a really, really dry summer right up until a little while before, maybe like a few days before this photo was taken. So it had enough time to look a bit more lush than it had the previous week. Lots of scrub oaks, pitch pine, Pinus rigida, overstory, really, really different sort of ecosystem than you would expect to see upstate. And you can also see in the trail there, very, very sandy. The Albany Pine Bush is basically this series of sand dunes. So where is it, you know, kind of zooming out and looking at it regionally? It's in the capital region of upstate New York. And if we zoom in a little bit more, I know this map is a little bit busy, but I wanted to show it this way because the areas in green that are highlighted, these are the areas that are currently in the preserve. And what you can notice on that larger map is that it is surrounded by suburbia. So the biggest issue with the Albany Pine Bush has always been development. And of course, one major thing that comes with development, right? Fire suppression, because this is actually a fire-dependent ecosystem, which again is very unusual for upstate New York. The forests in that area do not tend to burn well. And the vegetation that's in most of upstate New York is not the sort of vegetation you would expect to find on, you know, a pine barren sort of ecosystem. The soils, the adaptive conditions, yes. Pinus rigida. Pitch pine. Sorry? Rigida, yes. And there's a few other ones. There's also Pinus strobus is scattered, but Pinus rigida is really the dominant keystone tree species in this ecosystem. And we'll have a few pictures of those. So what are some of the major events in the Albany Pine Bush? You can imagine that this really weird area that kind of stuck out from the surrounding landscape drew some serious interest during colonization. So in the 1600s, what was called the King's Highway, which was originally a series of footpaths by the Mohawk people, started to be utilized by colonists to traverse what they called the Pine Plains between Fort Orange, which is present day, which is on the site of present day, almost downtown Albany on the Hudson River, and the city of Schenectady. In the 1700s, colonists begin large-scale pitch pine harvesting. So in the 1600s, a lot of what the pine bush was used for was furs. Was basically that was the main product that came out of there: furs, firewood. But as the population started to increase, the exploitation, of course, started to increase as well. They started to cut more of the large pitch pines. In the 1800s, the extensive sand deposits started to be mined for glass production. So if any of you have heard of Corning glassware, it's manufactured in upstate New York, a couple hours from the Albany Pine Bush. So it was a really, really convenient place to mine sand and not have to ship it very far. And in the 1800s, this is when a lot of the local people started to really realize that development was taking a very, very severe toll on this unique ecosystem. Fast forward a bit into 1967, the Northway Mall was constructed on about 59 acres of pine bush. And it was demolished in 1999, but the site is still occupied by big box retailers. In 1969, the city of Albany, seeing all of this open space with not a lot of trees that had to be removed that could be easily developed, decided to put its landfill here. So that occupied a lot of space as well and started causing a lot of issues with the local hydraulics. In 1974, this is when suburbia and housing really started to infiltrate the area. The Dunes housing development was constructed right in the middle of the remaining pine bush area. And this impacted several hundred acres. I've seen anywhere from 200 to 300 acres estimated as the impact here. In 1984, Crossgates Mall was opened, which is a large regional scale mall, and this impacted another 175 acres. So you can see we're whittling away at this area bit by bit, and not small bits either. We're lopping off chunks of this really unusual ecosystem. But Eventually, water started to find its level with the local people and with the state itself. And the New York State Legislature in 1988 approved the Albany Pine Bush Commission, which established and maintained the remaining Albany Pine Bush lands as a nature preserve. And if we go back to that previous slide, the pine bush, the dark green, was that original 1988 Pine Bush Preserve acreage. And the light green are parcels that they've since acquired from, people, private entities, corporations, to add to the preserve. So let's look at a little bit about the geology here behind this. Why is it such a unique ecosystem, in this seemingly, why is it this sea of sand dunes surrounded by typical northeastern hardwood deciduous forest? Well, topsoils themselves, just like you can see on the one photo, they are sand dominated, and they accumulated from wind and wave action following of glacial Lake Albany. So during the last ice age, there were these glacial lakes that were present in the region, and glacial Lake Albany, as it receded due to wind and wave action, piled up this dune field of sand, really coarse material, and that remains today. And these edaphic features are what sets apart the Albany pine bush, because that's really what's governing the presence of some of these unusual species that you'd usually find, in sand dunes along a coastline of, one of the Great Lakes or the Atlantic itself. So by about 11,000 years ago, the lake had drained, and the sand deposits left behind were basically shaped into the dunescape that we know and see now by wind. And again, just to kind of drive home how sandy this is. This looks like somebody came in with beach sand and just dumped it on the trails. No, that's just what the open soil looks like. It is sharp sand. And when we have a series of hot days, even if they're sandwiched between really, really wet days, everything here, when it gets really, really lush from heavy rains, it will almost immediately wilt after just a few hot days. So this is a really stressful ecosystem for a lot of the plants that live here. And this is why a lot are really, really well adapted to those conditions and only occur in upstate New York right there. So a little bit of the geography now. So the area surrounding the Albany pine bush, which is kind of highlighted at the top of that map with the red star, is actually part of the Appalachian Valley and Ridge province. So it's technically southern hardwood deciduous forest, which is not what you would typically think of upstate New York. And it predominates and kind of goes up the Hudson Valley for a way, kind of near the border with Vermont, and that's what surrounds the Albany pine bush. The pine bush itself, like I mentioned earlier, is fire dependent. And remember that map with all the suburbia that had started to grow and develop, and really infiltrate this ecosystem. The preserve manages a lot of these different parcels in slightly different ways, but they use fire quite a bit. So thank goodness the preserve was established in 1988, because if suburbanization had continued to grow and grow and grow into this ecosystem, it would be really, really difficult to use fire at all, because we are so close. Some of these areas that have prescribed burns are so close to suburbia, to residential neighborhoods. And it's tough to do right now. Imagine if there had been another decade or another 2 decades of this kind of growth and development. It would be, maybe impossible to have the burns that are necessary to keep this ecosystem going. Without the prescribed burns and also mechanical disturbance closer to the residential neighborhoods, basically what happens to the Albany pine bush is that you get populus and deltoides and tremuloides and grandidentata. And these poplars and aspens, they come in, unless it's a really, really dry season, they tend to do what poplars do, grow really, really fast, outcompete the scrub oaks. But the worst thing. The worst thing is Robinia pseudoacacia. This species will come in. It was heavily used in the past in upstate New York. It's very, very common there. It will come into these really coarse, well-drained, pretty sterile soils, pretty cation poor soils. and it will just start pumping nutrients and organic matter into these soils and basically start nasifying the sand dunes and, of course, the valleys between the sand dunes. So black locust, this Robinia pseudoacacia, basically, if it's allowed to just go unchecked in this preserve, it basically takes it into a more typical forest that you can expect in the area. We start losing that fire-dependent character. It starts out-competing the native vegetation. It starts adding all this nutrition and organic matter. Suddenly the soils become a lot more water retentive, and the character of the preserve completely changes. So the biggest enemy, I should say, to the Albany Pine Bush is Robinia pseudoacacia, and the preserve invests a ton of resources in removing it. The fire, but the thing is, there's so many reservoirs of black locust all around the preserve that it immediately colonizes those open mineral soils right after a burn. So the preserve has to stay right on it. But now let's start getting into the good stuff while we're all here. Let's start looking at some of the oaks that are present in this preserve. And this bit of a spoiler for one of the trees that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more depth later on. Why are we interested in oaks? Well, a lot of characteristics. If we think of oaks as a big group, they exhibit a range of pH tolerances, a huge range of heat and drought tolerance. Some of them are very, very cold hardy. Some of them, some hybrids especially, don't set very many fruits, or if they do, they do so very, very sparingly, which is the case on the. They have multi-seasons, right? A lot of them have really, really nice, pretty buck leaves. They're just the case for you guys. They're awesome. A lot of traits that are great for horticulture, and not just horticulture, but a lot of them are wildlife friendly. So if we have an urban landscape where maybe we can afford a little bit of messiness to feed the critters nearby, oaks are a great choice, right? So in the Albany Pine Bush, we have several native oak species. In the Albany Pine Bush and the area surrounding it is this really, really cool melting pot of oaks. All oak species that are native to upstate New York. Of those, 8 are present. 3 more adjacent, literally, them away. The only upstate area is Quercus shumardii, which is in extreme far western New York out near Buffalo. Within the preserve, I kind of between and section Quercus, so what we tend to call the red oaks and the white oaks. We have which is one of the most common species in the pine bush. Quercus folia, which is one of the 2 that is extremely common as well, especially in areas where we can still do a lot of prescribed. Quercus and Quercus volupna, kind of some scattered trees that we see, especially in the lowlands between the dunes. And then in section Quercus, we have white oak, Quercus alba, Quercus bicolor, Quercus, which I saw in Virginia, in stands that were almost pure on some dry ridges. I see areas where they haven't been burned recently, full of Quercus. This is an oak species that is really in its element on those coarse, acidic soils just throughout the Appalachia. And of course, Quercus prunoides, which is maybe my low-key favorite oak species. If you look at my iOS page, it says Quercus muhlenbergii is my favorite species, but Quercus prunoides might be my second favorite, or maybe co-favorite, because of the similarities, but also because of how similar it is, but how different its adaptive tendencies are. And it's something that I think a lot of people aren't aware of and don't appreciate. And in the pine bush, it is one of the most important species present. Pine bush, Quercus, the pin oak, and this one because it is planted en masse in the Albany. So, I found what looks like north of the preserve in southern Sarasota County, in a wetland, and I can't be totally sure that it's native because there's so much development around that I'm not sure if they're volunteers from cultivated plants, but it looks like a large old stand that it's, it has the character of a native stand. So I'm working with the New York Natural Heritage Program to see if maybe this is a new county record for Saratoga, true zone 5 climate. So it might be the, most cold hardy edge of Quercus molustris population. And that's right there, right near the pine bush. Even if it's not, bet that the pine bush is being swamped with Quercus molustris pollen, just from the cultivated plants. Also nearby in areas, we have Quercus macrocarpa and Quercus. So something that didn't make it into my talk is this really cool geological feature that runs across the state of New York. There's this limestone outcrop, and it goes from the Hudson Valley all the way west, Buffalo area. And this limestone in the capital region manifests as this big, really steep escarpment called the Helderberg Escarpment, and it kind of towers over the pine bush. And that area is called Muhlenbergii. So on the escarpment, we've got quite a bit of Muhlenbergii, and then it's patchy in other places around the preserve as well. So just to show you the native ranges of some of the oaks that are present or adjacent to the preserve, as in the case of Quercus molustris. One thing is that a lot of these species, with the exception of Quercus rubra, are really close to the edge of their native range, to the northern edge of their range. A lot up north into the Hudson Valley, and that's peter out north of. That's certainly the case with Licifolia. It's the case with Quercus coccinea, volutna as well. Although there's a few patches of Quercus volutna that get a little further north, and that feature here, because one thing that I'm interested in is some of the genetics and traits that might be present in some of these edge of range populations. As it change, it might be possible to take this and start moving it a little bit further north, and that could have a lot of utility for horticulture in some communities. And then the section Quercus species. Several of these are close to the edge of their native range. Minoides, it has a little range extension into the St. Lawrence Valley, and it's upstate New York, south of the Adirondack Mountains, which is that gap in the distribution. Quercus primates, so we're right at the edge of range for that species. Quercus montana comes right up the Hudson Valley, like some of the red oaks we were just looking at. Same thing with Quercus bicolor. So we have some really cool genetics in this area. So now let's do a few of the oaks that are present in the itself. So oaks are difficult. If you're an amateur naturalist that trying to learn the oak species, it's intimidating, right? And this there's a pretty good amount of look fairly similar that it's going to be hard to really get a good handle on. The city forester that I mentioned, that wasn't sure if he could identify Volutna, and because of that, he wasn't even sure if it's a good species, which of course we know is, right? Volutna is very, very distinct, but is actually identifying these things. He was actually really good at identifying coccinea. And I think the reason for that is that coccinea is a little bit more common around some of the suburban and some of the urban areas in the Albany area. And in the pine bush, Quercus rubra and Quercus coccinea, they right together, right next to each other. They have very distinct growth. So growth habit of Tsuga canadensis, the tips of the new growth kind of like tilt over a little bit. Quercus coccinea in the pine bush actually looks kind of similar. It has sun leaves, have these really deeply cleft lobes and sinuses, and the new growth tends to like hang over a little bit. whereas Quercus rubra is more stiffly upright. The side by side, they look nothing alike. But of course, if you see one individually, without looking at some bud and acorn details, you might find a few plants. But for the most part, they are really, really discreet. Quercus coccinea in the pine bush is a lot. Quercus tends to exist. It tends to grow where there's Quercus coccinea, but more as scattered trees. It's definitely not as common as coccinea. Coccinea also, just my observation, seems like it's much better able to deal with fire. You'll find a lot of big multi-stem coccinea where it's clear that it had burned recently. And some trees, I think, that preserve marks and actually tries to keep some of the prescribed burns away from them. You can see that their growth habit is the legacy of fire in its path. It doesn't have much ability to survive the fire because the bark is very thin, but it tends to sprout up pretty well afterwards. Quercus rubra, I have not observed that same thing. And like I said, they're very discreet. And Quercus coccinea, if you go out into the pine bush in late October through early December, in an area that's been burned recently where it's sprouted up, just these fingers of what look like flame, just this intense scarlet color. Like scarlet oak is very, very well made. It's a very, very beautiful species. And these pine savannas, after a disturbance, with these fingers of bright, it really stands out. Quercus folia, following a fire, tends to be monoculture, where this species is really, really common, tends to be on like the southern exposures, especially on the dunes. Tolerant and toughest species, maybe the toughest woody species in the preserve. And this site here on this slide, this was burned in spring of 2021. It had been probably, I'm not sure how many years it burned before that, but the plant's 8 feet tall, clump forming. You could easily differences in clones here and there because they turn, slightly different colors in the fall. And they burned at the beginning of 2021. And by about halfway through the seed, they act really aggressively. And by the second photo of this year, it's just, I wouldn't even want to try to walk through this. It's just extremely dense branching. It's almost worse than like trying to get through like a rhododendron maximum colony in Appalachia. Like this is just extremely thick growth. To my surprise, if you kind of look underneath, there's a pretty good herbaceous layer below. Really rejuvenate and really force a lot of germination. Some of the herbaceous species that are on these dunes. So even though the Quercus ilicifolia is really, really predominant and forms this really dense, tight, interconnecting canopy, this looks like a really deceptively diverse, once you look below this canopy, really diverse ecosystem in terms of the plants. And of course, you can see the Pinus rigida overstory. They shrug off. If there's a Pinus rigida that has called pretty quickly from the population. And here's what it tends to look like, when it's growing just as an individual plant in a spot. Fire recently, small, max out around, maybe open grown like 20 feet in a few areas where they might be shaded by a few pitch pines that have interconnected canopies. They might stretch out a little higher to like 30 feet or so. They're pretty small trees, and they're very, very distinctive. They have these undersides of the leaf surfaces that I almost don't know what color to describe them as. They're almost like silverish brown. And when the wind comes through just a little bit, they ripple almost like, and you can see silvery sparkles from a distance. So imagine what that looks like on a monoculture like this. It's really, really cool. And it's not something you can see really anywhere in upstate New York that I know of except the pine bush. Very, very distinctive. Some of the leaves not familiar with the character and the appearance of the plant, it kind of looks like some of the southwestern oaks that we saw on the Texas tour and that we might see today. It's got, you know, a smaller, reduced leaf size, really thick, really tough, leathery. The sinuses, you know, aren't very deep. This season is to a really stressful, in terms of water availability, really stressful climate. So these get really, really hot and dry. And while we won't see anything that looks like a Quercus in terms of a little tiny tough leaf, in terms of what we'd see with most of the other species in the area, it's a much smaller, tougher leaf than you typically expect to find. Like I said, the leaf surfaces at the bottom are just this distinctive glossy brown that, you know, you wouldn't usually think of brown as attractive, but somehow this species makes it work. And this year was a really, really good mast year. So to my surprise, about every other year, the shrub oaks in areas that haven't just been burned, they mature a crop of acorns that tends to be pretty large. So these are clearly very, very happy plants. And if you're familiar with Quercus ilicifolia, you know that if you take some of these acorns and you look at them up close, especially once they've ripened and they turn brown, they have these like black, so Quercus ilicifolia, like kind of that I've only seen, and people that are local that have them on their private property like to use them for crafts and decoration. They're really cool. And they also look a lot different from some of the other oak species that are present at the preserve. So let's just take a quick look at Quercus rubra, because this is an important species here. But like I said, I would describe it as scattered, whereas you'll see all fire. Quercus there with the coccinea, but it's a harder plant to find. And usually you can spot it at a distance because it has these big leaves that don't have, you know, really deep sinuses for the most part. Sometimes the sun leaves are a little bit more deeply lobed, but the only, you know, leaf from a distance you might mistake it for might be Quercus volupna, and that species is extremely glossy. So you would never mistake the two if you saw them in person. And that brings us to the Quercus volupna slide. I tried really hard to take a picture that would really represent how glossy the leaves of this species are, at least in this corner. I think that leaf, that photo kind of shows you like how much they shine and just about glow in the light. If you're ever traveling in the Hudson Valley in upstate New York, maybe from New York City, a little bit further north for some reason, the woods next to the thruway, very, very oaky, lots of Quercus species. And you can spot these Quercus volupna as you drive by, even if you can't focus your eye on the leaves, because they shine. They're like so glossy, they stick out from everything else around them. Once you see it, even from a distance, I told that urban forester that I knew from Albany, once you see it, you'll never mistake it again, and you'll never think that it might not be distinct. It's very, very distinct, you know, even from a distance. And of course, if you get up close, it's even more distinct. It's got these big, you know, fuzzy tomentose buds, leaves. It's got those kind of orangey hairs, axils. You know, no doubt about it. Like when you find a Quercus volupna, and there are a few really, really nice Quercus volupna in the Albany area. I found in a residential neighborhood I live near, there's a really that tends to set large every year. So I have a bunch of seedlings that are from this roadside tree that's just, I could show it to you on Google Maps if anybody's interested. It's just this incredible, incredible tree in a residential neighborhood. Within the preserve itself, it's kind of like Quercus rubra. It tends to be patchy, where out across the landscape, you can see a few scattered trees, and then usually you can see a few you know, sapling-sized trees that are maybe sprouting back from fire. Quercus volupna is a little bit harder to find. It's definitely widespread, but you know, finding it, it's definitely scattered. Now, the really good stuff. which to me is maybe the most interesting thing, because I tend to like, you couldn't tell from my introduction, I like taxa that are difficult to tackle. I like things that are confusing, that I can, you know, put before the public and use it for some educational purpose. Because only mentioned earlier, thing, but you know, what purpose does it serve, right? If you are putting a group of plants together for educational purposes, for conservation purposes, you know, that's now you have like a targeted wing, and it serves a really good things. I'd really like to do is observe them, and see if maybe they might have some utility for horticulture. So I'm going to go through and just section Lobati species. And the first, because I think it's the coolest, this was the spoiler slide from earlier, the little reduced acorns. This is a putative, I should know these are all putative, right? Coccinia. So a lot of the hybrids that I've found, that I've spent a lot of time observing, tend to have ilicifolia involved. And I think that's a really coincidence, or maybe, I don't know, maybe it's not a coincidence, but it's really interesting to me because ilicifolia doesn't have a really wide range across upstate New York because it has such specific habitat requirements. So we typically wouldn't see intermediates between ilicifolia and some of the plants that we see in the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. So this one, this is something that I've been keeping an eye on for a while. It looks distance almost like a coccinia, but if you get up closer, you'll notice the leaves are really high gloss. And if you look at the buds, it tends to have some of the twig and bud features that illicit. It doesn't really look like a small tree right now. It's not a big, large specimen by any means. It's definitely still a juvenile, but it's older than 7 years. And it's, oops, skipping ahead to the slide I spoiled earlier, it's definitely not. So this was one of the features that I acorn production to aid my diagnostics the last few years. This is the first time I've even seen these structures on it. The plant, this far, I've seen it, and it the leaf surfaces. So even though the leaves tend to look more, the under just like ilicifolia. It's really convincing. When leaves of the tree flutter in the breeze, it has brown appearance, just like the ilicifolia shrubs do, but on a bigger, you know, upright statured young tree. Another indication that this is an intermediate of some sort is that this one has nice fall color. So it seems to have inherited from the putative coccinia. So a lot of times it's kind of an orange to a dull red. But that's pretty good because red fall color in ilicifolia, it's usually off brown, like kind of a yellow or maybe a ruddy orange, but not really anything you're going to be, you know, that's going to knock your socks off, that you're going to want to plant for that purpose. Another one that I found, and this is a hybrid that's pretty common across the range where these two overlap, is Coccinia rubra. And I had mentioned earlier how these two entities tend to stay pretty discreet, but and I, you know, I found this in fall of 2018, shortly after I moved there and was exploring the preserve, and I just, you know, is this a Quercus rubra that has deeply in sinuses? You know, does it just have more lobes? And I'm trying to look at the buds, you know, a hand lens, and I'm trying to feature. Well, it seems like it's intermediate between Coccinia and rubra, but it's hard for me to be confident, even though I've got examples of both, growing right next to it. It really looks like it's about halfway in between. But of course, if you're going to describe something as a putative hybrid, you want to have some good evidence of that. And if we look at the bud features, I tried really, really hard to take a close up, and I don't think I entirely succeeded. But the buds really, really look intermediate between Quercus rubra and Quercus coccinea. In addition, it's I've never seen it set acorns, so I've really, really been interested in waiting to see what the morphology of those look like, because the acorn morphology of those two species really sets them apart. Unfortunately, it hasn't cooperated that far just yet. It also, remember how I mentioned that coccinea has this really distinctive growth habit where the top, the apical shoots tend to be like kind of lax and hanging over, whereas the red oaks are stiffly upright. This individual tends to have that stiffly upright habit, even though it has much more deeply cleft leaves than a typical rubra. The rubra in this area also have very poor fall color. So I know Quercus rubra is often associated with nice red fall color. For some reason, the rubra in upstate New York, they don't tend to do this, at least that I've observed. They tend to die off this yellowish green, unattractive color. This individual here, bright fire engine red, and that's kind of another indication that, hey, maybe there's some coccinea genes involved here. So the next one, and this is actually the first putative hybrid that I found. This is a Coccinea velutina putative hybrid. The buds are very, very coccinea-like, but the leaves are very glossy. Really is green, high gloss sort of appearance. They're also tomentose in the abaxial vein axils, which is really similar to velutina. And they also have shallower lobes than what we typically expect to see with coccinea. From a distance, in terms of the gloss and the shade of the leaf, it tends to look almost exactly like velutina. And these two pictures here, I just took these a couple weeks ago. They're not the best pictures because there was a prescribed burn in this area, and it looks like the preserve staff wanted to keep this tree because it's right next to a walking path. And a lot of times they'll keep the distinctive, noteworthy trees that are right next to a path. The lower branches were burned and destroyed. So the one that I could reach, unfortunately, suffered heavy damage in the most recent prescribed burn. So this is a brand new flush of growth, and it doesn't quite have all the features, that really pop like they typically do. But you can still kind of see it's not really a coccinea-shaped leaf. The sinuses are not right. The lobing is just not right. It's something that looks a bit different. And it's really different. I was pick up one photo I'd taken from a previous year that shows how gloss the leaves are there on the left. On the right, I know it's really hard to see, but there's a really, really large coccinea right there on the right. And then this tree is a smaller one because it's a little bit downslope. This is actually on the edge of a sand dune, and the larger tree is right near the top of a sand dune. And if you go down slope a little bit, that's where this putative hybrid is. And you can kind of see maybe a little bit in this picture how darker green and lustrous the foliage looked. It's right on the edge of the tree clump that's like just to the left of that larger coccinea canopy. And of course, one thing that I like to do is I like to find these abandoned versions of species. So when I first discovered this tree, it was in full autumn finery. And I had really thought that I finally found a Quercus velutina with nice, but closer look, it looks like it's an intermediate, which is still cool. But I'd like a pure-blooded Coccinea. If anybody knows one of those, reach out to me. I'd love to hear about it. A rubra hybrid. From a distance, and this is a pretty good sized upright tree. It looked kind of like an odd rubra, just with, kind of a more compact leaf shape, shorter, not as long as rubra usually gets. But the buds and the acorns look a lot more, they tell a different story. The buds look a lot more like ilicifolia, and it was really windy when I took this photo, so I couldn't really get a good close-up of the buds. But the acorns really don't look like rubra acorns at all. And in fact, they have a lot of that ilicifolia character to them, where they almost have like this kind of like sharp angled, almost pointy appearance. And on the one acorn, you can kind of see the side profile up near the top of the image. It kind of has that character to it. This one found this, so I'm not sure what the fall color is like. And ilicifolia is usually pretty unimpressive. It's probably nothing to write home about. But just a little bit more detail. The buds are shorter and less elongate. They're less acuminate than what you typically see on Quercus rubra. And the underside, a little bit silvery, but not really as distinctive as that other hybrid I showed you. So this one's a little bit, this one for ID, I'm relying more on the acorns. I also found an interesting iliciform that until recently I had believed was probably just a pure ilicifolia that happened to be a large growing clone. I've never seen set acorns, so I couldn't really use the acorns as any sort of diagnostic. The foliage on ilicifolia glossy, spectrum. Some of them are pretty matte green, and then others are like, you know, have just about a mirror finish. This clone tends to be glossier. The fall color is kind of like a brassy to ruddy orange, you know, nothing to write home about. Really, really good marcescence. Like, it just about keeps all those leaves through the winter most years. But this year, I finally caught acorns developing on it. And it turns out that they look like Quercus volumina. And there's a lot of Quercus volumina around this tree. So really, really volumina-like. Again, kind of windy, so I couldn't get the greatest picture. But the buds also look a lot more like Quercus volumina. I actually took one branch so I could take a close-up in the lab without the wind blowing on it, because I was so excited that it looks like this might be a hybrid. This is just a pure-blooded Quercus ilicifolia, but it has really, really nice, consistent red fall color. And this photo was taken in early November of last year, I believe, maybe the year before. And it will hold that color until usually about the last week or so in November, maybe a little into December. And then it'll turn brown and marcescent. It'll stay on the leaf. It'll stay on the tree. And it's a really, really pretty form of Quercus ilicifolia. Typically, that species, you know, like I said, it's kind of a spectrum, but it's usually not all that impressive. Green, or maybe kind of a light yellow green. Every once in a while, in terms of color, rust orange, but bright clone scene. And this, because this is the boundary of the preserve by about 15 feet. So I used to live in the development right next to the edge of the pine bush, so I could just walk outside and look at things whenever I wanted. So I have just this clone guy Star Hill. So whether this trait, you know, time will tell. And I'm also asexually. So if anybody has any tips on what I can graft Quercus ilicifolia onto, let me know. Typically a heavy seed producer as well. So if this I sample and collect from this plant. No pressure. Now about there's only a few of these hybrids to go through. So Quercus prinoides, like I said, one of my favorite plants. You know, maybe second to Muhlenbergii, and maybe my co-favorite. The growth habit in the pine bush and really the traits that this plant exhibits are really, really variable. It can be anything from like a shinnery oak that's really, really short to like a 25-foot tree. And some of those bigger specimens that grew tall, I've exhibited really closely for signs of introgression, and I can't find any morphological that look like, you know, they're introgressed. I'd expect that they would be. It just variation of the species in the preserve. This year, really, really early, and I think that might be because we had such a dry year. Some most harsh environments on the dunes will have a really small, reduced leaf, almost, you know, our on the 14th of August. Usually, the acorns are fully matured and out of their caps. Over. They usually start. So this is really, really early. The earliest we've seen in this area on Pinus. Some of the forms have really, really pretty blue-green foliage, and some of them are really, really glossy. And the clone in this has both. So there's definitely opportunities if the preserve granted someone permission to collect for horticultural purposes. There's a lot of opportunities to select for this species. This just a small with good fall color, with leaves, a lot of opportunity. Here's a larger growing one, just see it pretty almost type bark, which kind of hints at its affinities. They often have really pretty red fall color as well. A few putative hybrids now. I found Alba Prinoides hybrid. It's really shrubby and robust. It was burned a couple years ago and it responded by just suckering all over the place. And for that reason, I believe that Prinoides is in its ancestry. I haven't been able to view any acorns because of its recent response to the fire. Just so that might help me tell this. No good fall color. The Alba in this area tends to be really, really pretty, but the Prinoides is a mix. You know, through the short straw fall color. This because just put a picture of my cats up instead. You're not missing. It's an all clone, no appreciable fall color, covered in powdery mildew. Bark looks similar to Quercus montana. It's an ugly, ugly tree. And I'm just noting it because just to show you the mix of what we can find here. I haven't found any attractive montana hybrids. I've found a few smaller trees that look like they're that, but I'm not really all that sure. I garden for plants that are particularly grotesque, and this tree it has no useful purpose as far as I can discern. It doesn't use acorn wildlife. Haven't seen yet, for sure. Haven't been able to catch it with catkins. Oh, sorry. A little slow on my feet. Very nice, very nice. One putative hybrid that I found in a batch of seed that I was able to collect outside of preserve property, but very close adjacent, actually not far from that ilicifolia that I can sample, was these, at least I assume so, hybrid. Pronounced, you can see the seed tray, and I collected from some Prinoides that turned red. The seedlings are turning red. You can see them in the background as being typical. This seedling, densely tomentose underneath, you know, which Prinoides is not. And really, really just super strong growth, kind of an aberrant leaf shape. Pretty much exactly what I would expect of a bicolor Prinoides cross. Unfortunately, this plant was destroyed by rodents, so I will not be able to try it out. iOS gives me, you know, by losing this plant, but it looks.
Great tour. Question. A lot of these species are range. Most intrograph swarms, these combinations.
None that I have been able to discern. It looks like most of the hybrids, with the exception of that Ilicifolia rubra cross that we just recently discovered. Right. Right here, this is increasing acorns. So it looks like pretty intact, even if there's F1s present.
Phil, these for the seed exchange, are they ripe enough?
Now, the only ones that were ripe enough were Prinoides, and a few of them were falling out of the cap, but the only ones I found that were ripe were within the preserve boundary, so I don't have permission to collect.
Okay, courtesy of Red Baron.
But you already have some though, guy.
Yeah, but there's some others I'm going to trade you some stuff. We'll talk.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'm going to be working on getting a collection permit within preserve boundaries, so there might be an opportunity to share small quantities in the future. So if you're interested in that, definitely reach out.
Any other questions for Phil? Couple more.
Thanks for the great talk. So the Albany Pine Bush is not far away from other, pine barren scrub ecosystems in the Northeast. Most of those are located closer to the coast. Would you say it's representative of those other pine barrens as well, or is it significantly different just because of its ecological history and management as well?
Yeah, I haven't had a big opportunity to explore some of the other ones, but from what I've been reading, it's pretty similar to some of the other coastal ecosystems. Some of the preserve staff, some of the scientists there have told me that to their eye, it looks very similar to the Jersey Shore and to the communities there. I've never been. Pine barrens in a little bit further north, I believe in Massachusetts. And, to my eye, as I was quickly traveling through it, I did see a lot of really familiar species. But I believe, just from what I've heard and from what I've read, it's more similar to not down. I've also heard Long Island very similar.
Thanks.
Before that, taking suggestions on what to graft it onto, I say you could try growing your own roots from acorns from that. That way, it's closely related. And you might have
In progress.
great.
But yeah, it's probably the best for the fall as well. I'm a little bit hesitant to use because sometimes plants fool us, like Acer Saccharinum, that have brilliant red fall, a bit older and a little bit bigger, and they're just the normal drab yellow-green Acer Saccharinum. So time will tell, but that's a great suggestion. Hopefully it'll be compatible with some of its siblings or half sibs.
Coccinia by Ilicifolia look really interesting. Two questions. Was that one? And are you looking into propagating by grafting?
Yes, it's just one specimen. It's a pretty upright. It's still small, so I had to guess that like it's DBH. It's probably, instead of just throwing a number at you, figure out a way that I can propagate it in a culture of some kind in my lab. I think it'd be a project perhaps. So that'll probably be the angle we take, and if it's really promising, maybe we can. It'll be something